February 7, 1925 marked the first time Trinidad and Tobago held a national elections. However, it looked vastly different from the elections we participate in now. Today marks 100 years since Trinidad and Tobago held its first national elections, and we take you on a journey through history. For decades, Trinidad and Tobago was ruled by a pure crown colony, meaning there were no elected members on the Legislative Council that governed the country. Since 1832, when the Legislative Council was established, people argued for elected members to be on the council, but the Crown Colony rejected it. Two major movements gripped the 1880s and 1890s for constitutional reform, particularly to allow elected members. Historians call it the Reform Movement. It was led mainly by the middle and upper classes, particularly mixed-race and Afro-Trinidadian lawyers. But the governor of Trinidad vetoed their calls for reform.
The men who made policy for the colonial empire, the politicians and the civil servants in London, had deep prejudices which led them to believe you could not trust colonies where the people were mainly non-white, were black, were brown, were Chinese, were Indian. You could not trust them with representative institutions, with elected members. Okay, you could give them to Canada, you could give it to Australia, New Zealand, because there most of the population was white and British. Not so in the Caribbean or the African or the Asian colonies.
But World War I would change everything. From 1919 into 1920, unrest gripped Trinidad and Tobago. There were riots, strikes, and protests. And it wasn't just Trinidad and Tobago, but all across the British Caribbean colonies there were reform movements. Under mounting pressure, the British sent its Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies, Major E.L.F. Wood, to investigate Trinidad and Tobago's preparedness for self-government. In his report, Major Wood recommended the Legislative Council has 12 ex officio members, or 12 members from the Crown Colony, 6 nominated unofficial members, and 7 elected members. However, the governor of the islands will have both an original vote and a casting vote, meaning the Crown Colony would always have the majority. Then came the voting regulations. To qualify to vote in the 1925 general elections, you had to own a house or a piece of land at a certain value, or you had to have an income at a certain value. But you also needed to understand spoken English. This placed a lot of Indo-Trinidadians at a disadvantage, because in 1925, not many Indo-Trinidadians understood spoken English. But there was more.
Men who could qualify on property and or income had to be 21. Women had to be 30. Notice the discrimination right there. And a woman could only qualify to vote if she owned property or earned an income in her own right. So you might be the wife of a wealthy man, he qualifies to vote, you do not. So it was only a tiny handful of women who were qualified to vote.
Overall, roughly 6% of the population were eligible to vote in Trinidad and Tobago's first national elections in 1925. It wouldn't be another 20 years until this country achieved universal adult suffrage, meaning every adult 21 years and older had the human right to vote. For the first national elections, Trinidad had 6 constituencies and Tobago had 1. Charles Henry Pierre ran unopposed in the eastern counties, and so did Thomas Meade Kelshaw in Victoria County. But it was Port of Spain that provided the most exciting race. Captain Arthur Andrew Cipriani, who was the president of Trinidad's Working Men's Association, came up against Randolph Rust, a pioneer of Trinidad's oil industry, and Gaston Johnson, a prominent lawyer.
In that Port of Spain election fight, many people, men and women, who could not vote, they couldn't meet the property or income qualifications, still took part in the contest. They would attend Captain Cipriani's meetings, they would cheer and yell for him, and they would go to his opponents' meeting and heckle them. Also, interestingly, calypsos were written and sung, urging folks, the people who were eligible to vote, to go out and vote for Captain Cipriani.
He was born 60 years ago. Can you tell me of a better man that you know? He is known as a poor man's friend. For the right, he'll fight it out to the end. In politics, he is really strong, for he knows the right from the wrong. He's our friend and pride of this colony, gallant Captain Cipriani.
Captain Cipriani would win the Port of Spain constituency handsomely. He held the seat until his death in 1945. In the Caroni County, businessman Saran Tilok Singh was elected the first Indo-Trinidadian member of the Legislative Council. He had the support of the East Indian National Congress, one of the two important bodies that spoke for Indo-Trinidadians. Two other Indo-Trinidadians would be elected in the elections of 1928. In Tobago, James Alexander Bigot, the owner of a pharmacy in Scarborough, was elected as the island's first representative. Professor Bridget Brereton says the reforms and ultimate election of 1925 gave people hope in Trinidad and Tobago that more reforms would come.
It is to the credit of the people of Trinidad and Tobago and successive governments that we have managed to have regular, fair, and free elections. Not every country can say that. Not every country, even in our own region of the world, can say that.
100 years later, and Trinidad and Tobago's general elections look almost unrecognizable from where we started. So when you cast your ballot in this year's general elections, consider the struggles and sacrifices born over a century ago.